Hello friends, it's Andrea. I hope you're doing well. I am here with an extended tutorial. Today I am going to be sharing with you everything I learned from my first year in the Sewspire Friendship Circle. If you are not familiar, the Friendship Circle is the quilting group that I started last July. And so we met one day each month to focus on a new quilt block. And as a part of that process, I learned a variety of quilting skills, which I am going to share with you in this video today. So what I did for this particular video is I selected my top two favorite quilt blocks, which are the Friendship Star and the Churn Dash block, and then one other surprise block, which you will soon find out why it's a surprise. And I designed this quilt for us to make together so that I could show you the skills that I acquired as a result of my friends in the Friendship Circle who were so generous to share their knowledge and their love of quilting. So in this video, I am going to show you how to make those three blocks, how to join them together, how to add borders to your quilt, how to add the quilt batting, the backing, quilt it, and add real binding. Now the binding is what excites me the most about this project because I was under the misconception for decades that binding was difficult. It really isn't. Now, full disclosure, I am still 100% a novice quilter, but I have come leaps and bounds from where I was before I joined the Friendship Circle. So before we get started, I have a complimentary PDF for you. This document outlines all the pattern pieces, the supplies, and then there are some grids so you can draw in the blocks and then shade those with your colors. So hopefully that helps simplify the process for you. In total, I worked 2 days, sun up to sundown, to produce this one video for you as a way to express my gratitude to the people who showed up and taught me how to quilt. My intention for this video is to spark the love of quilting in those of you who are out there and think that, one, it's difficult, or two, that you might not enjoy it. You could be surprised. So my challenge and invitation to you is watch this video, absorb the knowledge that I acquired over the last year from experts, true experts. They've been quilting almost their whole lives. They have so much knowledge to share, and they were so gracious to share it with us. If at the end of the video you'd like to know more about quilting, you are invited to join the Friendship Circle and participate in year 2, which begins in August of 2023. Everything you need to know about the Friendship Circle and your complimentary PDF can be found down in the notes. So without further ado, shall we get started? Okay, we are going to begin by going over the pieces which you will pre-cut, and we will use these pieces to create the blocks, which we will then join together to create the quilt top. So I have gone through and sorted all of the pattern measurements by light color, mid color, and dark color to make this process really simple for you. So we will begin with the light colored fabric. You are going to need 16 squares, which are 4 7/8 inches. And I have those right here. So you may be wondering how to get 4 7/8 inches. What I like to do is measure over the 4 inches on my mat, and then on the 5th inch there, I bump my clear ruler in the 1/8 of an inch, and then I cut. Some of you may have other ways of doing that. Please leave a note in the comments and help out the new quilter. You are going to want 4 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch squares in a light fabric. You are going to need 16 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles, and you're going to need 1 7.5 inch by 7.5 inch square. And I have all of these pattern measurements for you in one handy PDF, which I recommend you highlight or put a little dot next to the ones that you have already cut out. Now moving on to my mid-range print, you're going to need 16 4 7/8 by 4 7/8 squares and 2 7 by 7 squares from the mids. And then moving on to my darks, you're going to need 20 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares and 16 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles and 1 7.5 by 7.5 inch square. And so these pieces in the dark, the mid, and the light are what we're going to use to craft the blocks. This is all you'll need to craft the blocks. We are going to have 9 blocks, and I have selected 3 different styles of blocks. I will teach you how to make each of those blocks, and you will be crafting 4 friendship star blocks, 4 churn dash blocks, and 1 windmill block for a total of 9 blocks, which we are going to piece together in a specific layout. And then we're going to add 2 borders to those 9 blocks, and then we're going to add some quilt batting and our backing, and we will quilt our top. And then we are going to bind our quilt to have a finished, beautiful piece. So I will show you step by step in this tutorial how to craft each block, join those together, add the borders, add the batting and backing, and bind this so you have a gorgeous quilt that you can be very proud of. If this is going to be your first quilt ever, please drop a comment down in the notes so I know. I promise I will make this easy, and I will show you every step of the process. The first block that I am going to teach you how to sew is called a friendship star, and we will be making 4 of these in total. I am going to sew one with you, and then you are going to make 3 more. So I have my 3 friendship stars crafted and pressed, and I am going to sew the fourth one with you. So for the friendship star, you are going to need 5 of your 4.5 by 4.5 squares in the darker fabric that you have selected. And then you are going to need 2 light squares that are 4 7/8 and 2 mid squares that are 4 7/8. And you are going to pair up a light with a mid, and you should have 2 sets for each of these blocks, plus your 5 4.5 by 4.5s. So the 4.5-inch squares we are going to set aside for a moment, and these 2 pairs of 4 7/8, we are going to use our ruler to draw a line diagonally, so corner to corner, and you're going to do that with both sets. And I'm just using a permanent marker. Then you're going to put this on your machine deck using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to stitch down the right hand side of the line and then down the opposite side of the line. So there'll be a row of stitching on each side of the line. So I just line up that left hand edge of my 1/4 inch presser foot right on that line. And I'm using 2.5 inch stitch length. I have a 90-14 needle in here, but that's what I always use. You could probably go a little smaller depending upon your fabric selection. So I'm stitching first down the right hand edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You do not back stitch when you are quilting or piecing. Now I'm going to stitch right off the edge, and I'm going to bring up my second pair, and I'm going to go ahead and line that up so the line is right on the left hand edge of my 1/4 inch presser foot. And then I'll stitch down the right hand side of that piece without breaking the thread. And then same thing, I'm just going to stitch right off the end of that, and then I can cut my thread. So now I have made it down one side of that line. I'm just going to rotate these around so that I can stitch on the opposite edge of the line. Now I have 2 rows of stitching on each side of that pink line. I can now go ahead and snip these apart where I had chain stitched them, and then I'm going to put these on my cutting mat, line up the ruler right on that line, and cut right down the center exactly on that line. And then you can see when I open these up, I have 4 squares. These are called half square triangles. And I have 4 of those, which I crafted from those 4 squares, which I paired up light and mid. So now what I want to do is head over to the iron and press the seam towards the darker side. And now I have 4 half square triangles neatly pressed. Now you can come in at this point and trim up these little dog ears, they call them, that are on each end. I personally do not do that, but I just wanted to mention it in case you were wondering. You probably should trim those up. I will show you the back of one of mine without it trimmed. I'm okay with this. So you just make a decision that works best for you, but I thought that that was worth mentioning. Okay, now it is time to lay out our friendship square. So you're going to place one of your 4.5 inch squares in each corner and one in the center. And then you are going to position your half square triangles in between there. So this is when you will need to pay close attention. For the top row, the lighter fabric should be on the top. For the center row, the lighter fabric should be on the top on the left, and on the bottom on the right, and then in the third row the lighter fabric will be on the bottom. So once you get yours laid out on your cutting mat, what I suggest you do is use your phone to take a picture of the block laid out, and then have a look at that on your phone. I'm not sure why it works, but it is much easier to catch a mistake in your layout looking at a photo than looking at the actual fabric on your mat. So I'm going to join the pieces in each row, and then I will connect the 3 rows. So I like to bring the center piece up on my deck, and then the right hand piece, and position that right side's facing, and then I stitch down that right hand edge using the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, just a friendly reminder, there's no back stitching necessary. And then I bring over that remaining left hand piece and I lay it on top of that center panel. And then I'm going to stitch down that right hand side. And I essentially flipped that upside down. So you're going to want to reference that photo I told you to take and make sure that you lay this row back down correctly. Okay, then I'm going to repeat the same thing, starting with that center piece and then going from the right hand side, right side's facing, stitching down that right edge. I am going to align those inner seams, and as I approach that seam I will fold the seams, one to the right and one to the left. And then after I clear that first seam, I will get my second seam aligned. And same thing, I'm going to have one seam pointing up and one seam pointing down. And here's what that looked like. And your seam should be aligned. It is perfectly okay if they're slightly misaligned, no worries. So now I have my bottom, my center. I want to take my top row and position it right sides facing on that center row. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to align that first seam, and then I'll align the edges here close to the needle, and then I will lower that presser foot and stagger those seams, stitch all the way down that right hand edge using the 1/4 inch. Approaching that second seam, doing my best to keep it all aligned. And voila! So here we have the churn dash block. I think this is my favorite block that I've learned how to make so far. It is a lot of fun, and one day I hope to make a quilt just from the churn dash blocks. So again, you're going to need 4 of the churn dash blocks. I have 3 pre-made, and I'm going to make one with you so you know exactly how to do that. So for the churn dash block, you are going to be needing 1 4.5 by 4.5 inch light square, 2 4 7/8 inch mid squares, and 2 4 7/8 inch by 4 7/8 inch light squares. So these are also going to be half square triangles. So you are going to pair up the 4 7/8 inch mids and lights, and then draw your line down the center of those. And then you are also going to be needing 4 light and 4 dark 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles. So you will be pairing up a dark and a light rectangle right sides facing so that you have 4 sets. These rectangles are going to get stitched down that center line using the 1/4 inch seam allowance to create 4 squares. So these can go right up on your machine deck for when we are ready to stitch. The 4.5 inch square is going to get set aside momentarily while we craft these remaining squares. So I'm going to take my set of half square triangles and draw that line diagonally, corner to corner, so that I know to stitch on each side of that. Okay, I'm going to start with the half square triangles. You'll remember from the friendship star that I'm using the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm stitching along the right hand side of both and then the opposite side of both, so that there's a line of stitching on each side of my pink line. Okay, so I have stitched down both sides of those. I'm going to go ahead and separate them where I chain stitched, and then I will bring them over to the cutting table there. Use my ruler to line that up right on that line I drew down the center, and I'll cut on that, and that's what will create my new half square triangles. And in total I'll have 4 of those, which I will need to take over to the iron and press to the dark side. I am also going to need to press these little half square rectangles that we're about to prep, so I will press everything at one time. So I want to take these rectangles, which you remember we paired up right sides facing, and down that right hand long edge I'm going to stitch to join those 2 pieces of fabric using the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And these can also be chain stitched. You just run that thread right off the edge, and you have a little trail of half square rectangles. Once you get those stitched, then you can clip where you chain stitched, and you will take these over to the pressing table and press those so the seam heads towards the dark side. I have my 4 half square triangles and my 4 half square rectangles and my solid 4.5 inch square. So the 4.5 inch square goes in the center, and then that is framed by the half square rectangles. The darker fabric butts up against that center square, and then you position a half square triangle in each corner, and the lighter fabric is towards the edge. So you're going to go through and build out your rows just like we did with the friendship star, working with that center piece first, pairing up 2 pieces at a time, 1 row at a time, and then we'll join those rows. Don't forget to take a photo of the layout before you start piecing, just in case you get confused or turn your pieces around. You can reference that photo and fix your layout. So now I have all 3 rows. I'm going to start by positioning the bottom row on top of that center row. I'll work from that right hand edge, and I'm going to do my best to line up those center seams and stagger those so that I have a nice press line. Okay, I've joined my bottom row and my center row. Now I want to bring that top row over and position it right sides facing on the center row. Line everything up on that right hand side and stagger those seams. And then voila, I have a churn dash block ready to be pressed. Now we are ready to craft our last block. This block is going to be in the center of the quilt. So for this block, you are going to need 2 of your mid 7 by 7 inch squares. You're going to need 1 7.5 by 7.5 inch square in a light, and one 7.5 inch by 7.5 inch square in a dark. You're going to take your light and your dark and layer those right sides facing, and then again we are going to draw a line down the center on the diagonal. We are not making a half square triangle, but we are going to use that technique to craft a square that actually has 3 triangles. So I have my line down the center. I'm going to go ahead and stitch down the right and the left hand edge of this. Okay, I've stitched down both sides of that line. Now I want to go ahead and cut it up that center line. And currently I have my 2 half square triangles. I'm going to press each to the dark side. Okay, after I press those half square triangles to the dark side, then I want to use my ruler and cut those on the diagonal from the dark to the light side, so that I end up creating 4 of these triangles. I'm sure this has a proper quilting term, but I do not know what it is. So you will end up with 2 that are the same and 2 that are mirror images of them. So these we're going to set aside for just a moment, and we're going to bring back over our 2 remaining squares, and these are 7 by 7, and we're going to position those right sides facing, and these are also going to get cut on the diagonal, corner to corner there, right up the center. And there should be 4 of these triangles, and with any good luck they are the same size as these dark and light triangles. Okay, so all of the pieces that we cut out for this are the pieces for the windmill block. However, this happened to me the first time I made it too. Somehow I don't end up attaching these correctly. So I believe every mistake is an opportunity to learn, and so this is our new block, crafted from the same cuts as the windmill block, with this unidentified mirror image mistake. But I rather like this look, and I think it's going to work really good with our layout. So if anyone knows what this block is called, please drop it in the comments. So I'll be excited to hear what this block is called, because I'm sure someone has found themselves in this position before. So with this, we have the 4 corners, and then we have our triangles with the darks touching and the lights touching. All right, so this is 4 squares, so we are going to just go ahead and position the triangles right sides facing. And that's a fun thing about quilting, is you can go rogue and you can fix your own mistakes and create your own unique piece. So I encourage you, have fun with these pieces as is and see what kind of layout you can come up with. So now I want to stitch along the longer edge of each triangle to join those. And then I'm going to take my 4 squares and I'm going to lay those back out. And who knows, I might even find another pattern that I like when I'm laying them out. You'll be able to position these squares in the center in any configuration that you like. And I'm kind of liking this look too, but I can see if I turn that a little bit. So please have fun with it and see what you come up with. And this is what I'm gonna go with. Okay, so I'm gonna position those right sides facing and stitch down those lighter edges. And then I'm gonna join these 2 rows. And on this one, all I have to worry about is lining up that center seam and nesting those. All right, and now I have my mystery center block, which I actually really like. So I'm gonna give this center block a nice press, and then it's time to lay out our 9 blocks and join those together. Okay guys, so I am rewinding just a bit here before you start to lay out your quilt and join the respective blocks and then create the rows. You're going to need to verify that your blocks are all the same size. So these blocks should be 12.5 inches wide when they are separate, so that when you join them, they end up being 12 by 12. And that's what I have here on my center block. All of the perimeter blocks, as long as you use the 1/4 inch seam allowance, should be 12.5 inches. This center block, because of the way the fabric is cut, is a smidgen larger. So you're going to want to true up your center block. So I just wanted to make sure that I emphasize to you, take this time now before you piece it together and press and measure and then true up your blocks to 12.5 inches if necessary. Okay, so I have the 9 blocks laid out. You should have a churn dash block in each of the 4 corners, the mystery block in the center, and then the friendship stars fill in the remaining 4 spots on this. So now we're going to work in the same way that we created the blocks. We're going to create 3 rows of 3 blocks each, and then we'll join those rows together. Now, many quilters will add something called sashing, which is a 2.5 inch or less strip of fabric in between each of the blocks. And what that does is separate the blocks and let them serve as focal points. We are going to be adding borders all the way around to increase the size of this project, but I did want to join the blocks together because there is a pattern that's forming here with these solid squares. And so once this is joined and quilted, that will create a really nice look. And I'm actually quite happy with my new mystery block in the center. So now that you can see this laid out, give some consideration to how you might twist these 4 squares here that crafted the center block and how they will interact with the fabric on each side of that. Okay, so this is meant to be fun. Feel free to customize that center block. It would also look great as a churn dash block. And then you have the churn dashes running right through the center. So I'm going to go ahead and position my blocks 2 at a time, right sides facing, to create my 3 rows, and then join those 3 rows. Okay, I have all 3 rows formed. Now I'm going to position the bottom row on top of that center row and join those together. I will be prioritizing the seams in the center there that were the outer seams of the block. And now I'm going to add the 3rd row. Okay, so our first border that we're going to put all the way around the perimeter of this quilt top is 2.5 inches wide. We are going to cut that to the width of the top and the bottom. So initially we're just going to be working with 2 border pieces. So you're going to want to measure your quilt top. Mine came in at 37.5 inches across the top and the bottom. So I cut my first border 38 inches wide. So I have a little bit of wiggle room there. So I cut 2 strips that are 2.5 inches by 38 inches, and I'm going to attach those to the top and the bottom by positioning them right sides facing, lining up those long edges, and using the 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch down. And I will do that at the top and the bottom. Okay, I have that attached to the top. Now I'm going to flip this around, and on the opposite end, which I will call the bottom, I'm going to attach that remaining 2.5 inch strip that I cut. Alright, now I have my top and bottom border on. So now this quilt panel is slightly longer than it is wide. So now I want to get the length measurement on this so I can cut my side borders. Okay, so I'm coming in at a 42 inch length. So I'm going to cut those side borders 43 inches long. So again, it's okay to be a little long because you can trim up. You just don't want to be short. So before I can attach those, I just need to trim up the excess from the top and bottom borders, which is very minimal, but you do want to use your ruler and you do want to trim that nice and straight so that your sides go on nice and straight. So line everything up and then just trim off that excess. That was maybe a 1/2 inch. And on this side, it's even more like a 1/4 inch. So I think it's easier to cut and trim than be too short and have to start over. And now I can take my 2.5 inch by 43 inch strips and attach those to the sides. Okay, I have one side attached. Now I'm going to attach the remaining side. Okay, I have attached both sides. Now I just want to clean up the excess from those. So I think it looks really nice with the light border on it. And that makes it just a little bit larger. So now what I would like to do is measure what was originally the top and the bottom, and you know that because there's a little seam here in the corner, whereas the sides span the whole side. I want to get the measurement across the top and the bottom, and so that is 42 inches. So now I want to use another complementary fabric. I thought this stripe would be really fun. I actually have a chevron as well, but I am torn because the chevron could be a lot of fun for the binding. The problem is I have lots of gorgeous choices here. I think overall we could use a little bit more green in this, so I want to pick a soft green. I think I'm going to go with this one here because it has the green and the pink in it, and it works good with the print that's in the center of this. And I am going to cut a 3.5 inch by 43 inch border for just the top and the bottom. So 3.5 by 43 for the top and the bottom. And I'm just going to position those right sides facing, and I will trim off the excess after I attach it. Alright, I have my second border across the top and the bottom. Now I just need to trim that up nice and straight. Okay, now I have my second border across the top and the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and give this a good press, and then I'm going to cut out my backing and my quilt batting. The backing can be flannel, it can be cotton, some people like the minky. You have a lot of flexibility on the backing as long as it's washable. I think anything that you have and like and that coordinates will work just fine for that. Just be sure you cut it a good 1.5 to 2 inches larger than your quilt top. So measure again, lay everything out on a big table if you can. You'll put the batting underneath of your pressed quilt top, cut that, and then you can measure again and cut out the backing, and that will go right sides facing out on the opposite side. So we will cover that all once I get my quilt top pressed good. Okay, so we're back, day 2 for me, one handy video for you, and I want to talk to you about the backing. So my finished quilt top measures 41 inches wide by 46.25 inches tall. So I cut the batting for that 44 inches wide by 50 inches tall. And I also want my backing, which is the fabric that is on the other side of the batting, to be 44 inches wide by 50 inches tall. So the easiest way to do that, if you don't have wide back quilting fabric, is to piece 3 half-yard cuts together. And I just press those and then position them right sides facing. I use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I join those. So now I have a 44 inch wide by 50 inch long backing panel that matches my quilt top beautifully. And what I did to trim up that excess in the length, because 3/2 yards is more than 50 inches, is I folded that in half and then lined that up on my mat, and I trimmed off just a smidgen there from the end. It worked out to be about 4¼ inches I had to trim off, but this allowed me to have the full 1/2 yard cut in the center and then my 2 accents on the top, so it'll be symmetrically pleasing to my eye. So what I want to do next is find a big open space. I use my kitchen countertop. I have a large island that works perfectly for this size piece. I was able to create my quilt sandwich, which has the quilt top right side facing up, a larger layer of quilt batting, and I really like warm and natural quilt batting. If you have a preference, use what you like, but that is my preference. And then on the back is my pieced backing. So when you cut the backing and the batting larger than the quilt top, it makes this process much easier, because you can imagine how difficult it would be to get 2 like-sized pieces of material and then a larger cut of batting aligned perfectly. The logic behind having the larger cuts of fabric is, as you quilt this, which is, if you're not familiar, we're going to actually stitch through all 3 layers, and that process is called quilting. But as you do that, the fabric will shift a bit. And so you don't want your quilt top to shift off of the backing or the batting. So it is just much easier to cut it larger. So after I get the quilt sandwich here quilted and I have stitched through all the layers, then I will trim up this excess. I'm not going to trim it right even with the quilt top, but I'm going to leave a little bit of extra batting and backing so that my binding is nice and plump in there. So here's what I have. Now the actual quilting process, this is plenty small enough that you could do this on your sewing machine. You don't need a long arm machine, although I will say I have had one on my wish list for a long time, and if I keep quilting, chances are pretty good that I will get myself a long arm machine. But for this particular project, keeping this video beginner friendly, you have a lot of flexibility with how you quilt this. A lot of people recommend that you use a walking foot, and that will help keep your bottom layers and your top layers moving through the machine with ease. That's a wonderful idea. So if you have a walking foot and you know how to attach it, go ahead and do that. I am probably just going to use my regular presser foot. Cringe, but I will go nice and slow and try to keep everything even. So you can quilt any pattern that you like. What I recommend though is that you follow the general lines of the piece and just stitch straight lines all the way across and then up and down. In no particular order. You don't have to measure, you don't have to be precise. Just as a rule of thumb, you want to have stitching every hand width. So roughly 4.5, 5 inches, you want to have a row of stitching, and that just holds the batting and the backing together, and then this quilt will last for a really long time through multiple washes. Okay, so I'm kind of considering coming in on the diagonal with this and then coming back across, so like a crisscross. I won't measure. I'll probably do some variation in the spacing so it looks intentional. If I don't do that, I may just do the straight lines as I have suggested for you, and it would be more of a checkerboard pattern. In the past, I have just free stitched across there with big wide turns so I could keep the feed dogs up and use that, and that's also lovely. So just keep in mind, the closer your stitches are together, your rows of stitching, the longer this process of quilting will take. If you space those out, the 4.5, 5 inches, you're gonna be done much faster. So take a moment now before you commit to how you're gonna quilt this and consider the level of patience you have for that and the amount of time that you currently have available to you. All right, so that's why I'm going to keep it simple for this project, because I want this entire quilt to unfold in one convenient video for you all. Okay, so again, this is a small quilt in comparison to, say, a king size, which would be much more cumbersome. So I have a pretty wide throat here on my machine, so this is not going to be a problem for me at all. I can pretty much start anywhere I want on this, and I will be okay. One thing that you definitely want to do before you start quilting your project is make sure you have a full bobbin. Just start with a full bobbin, and chances are pretty good you're going to be able to get a substantial amount of the quilting done on this size project. Now, if I haven't already mentioned to you, I know I included it in the PDF that accompanies this project. I am using 100% cotton Aurifil thread. Now this is a little bit more expensive. It is 50 weight, I believe. It is made in Italy, and it is a really lovely thread that my Juki TL2000 QI likes a lot. So it's worth it if you're going to go to this much trouble to select a good quality thread. Same is true for the fabric. Now, if you're just practicing, use whatever you have, and then when you're going to make a quilt that you plan to keep, go ahead and upgrade your materials. And then I did mention I have a 90-14 needle, and my stitch length is 2.5. All right, so that's what I'm going with for the quilting. Hope that helps you. And I think I am going to do the diagonal, because that'll be fun and add another layer of interest to this project. So initially I am going to start here in this top right hand corner. I also don't think I mentioned to you or clarified, I have used straight pins, and I have positioned those all over the quilt through all 3 layers to keep the layers together. It is recommended that you use safety pins. I have a brand new tub of safety pins somewhere and I couldn't find them. So I'm going to have to be very mindful and not poke myself, because I have these straight pins all over this. So I will capture some, but not all, of my quilting process on video for you, because it's not going to be that exciting. It's basically straight lines on the diagonal. So I'll give you the gist of it, and then I am going to work at a leisurely pace off camera and finish quilting. All right, so I just spent the last 2.5 hours quilting, completely random, all over this. And I initially started diagonally, then I came back in and added some skinny strips, some little wider strips of stitching, and then I came across horizontally. So I really have an eclectic mix here, and I like doing the random stitching on there because then you don't have to measure. You can really just drop into the zone and stitch, stitch, stitch. It's kind of meditative in a way, and with quilts you can always see more of the stitching on the back side there. So I'm very happy with that. Now all of my layers are nice and secure. So what I want to do now is come in and trim away the excess within a 1/4 inch of the quilt top. And so I'm going to use my ruler and my cutting mat for that. And then the next step after this is to prepare the binding, which I was really pleasantly surprised to learn how easy it is to bind a quilt using the method that I'm going to show you today. I was misled all of these years that binding was difficult, and so I always used the cheater method, where you just basically sew the backing to the quilt top with the batting right sides facing, and then turn, press, and seal up the edge. But then you miss out on the opportunity to add the detail with the binding. So I am excited to share with you, just in case you were also under the assumption that binding was difficult. So I'm going to go ahead and finish trimming this up, and then we will prep and stitch down our binding. Okay, now it's time to prep the binding. So I'm going to use this fun chevron, which I think will give a really neat look to the edge of this piece. And so I'm going to cut my binding 3 1/4 inches wide, with the hopes that I will have enough to just use this 1/2 yard cut of fabric. Alright, so out of that 1/2 yard cut, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strips. Now you may have also heard that you need to cut binding on the bias. That is not necessary for a rectangular quilt. So now I want to connect all 6 of these strips, and I am going to miter the corners on those, or cut in at an angle. So I'm going to overlap 2 pieces right sides facing, and then stitch corner to corner to join these, and I'll show you what that will look like in just a moment. So then when I fold that back, I have a nice continuous piece. So you will trim a 1/4 inch from that stitch line, and then you'll continue joining all 6 pieces using that method. Okay, I have joined all 6 pieces with those mitered corners, and now I have a very long piece of binding here, which I'm going to now take over to the iron, and I'm going to press wrong sides facing, and I'm just going to press that right in half long ways all the way down the binding. Okay, so now I have a nice little bundle of binding here, and the right side is facing out on both sides of that binding. So I want to take my quilt top and turn it over to the back, and I'm going to take that binding and start about a third of the way down on one side, and I'm going to line the raw edges of the binding up with the edge of the quilt back. So if you remember, I have a little bit of batting there that's overhanging the quilt front. So make sure you get your binding right up against the edge, and we're just going to go over to the machine, and using the 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're going to stitch until we get close to the corner at the bottom, and then I will zoom in and show you how to fashion the corners. So again, I just want to emphasize, because I really misunderstood this binding, the raw edges, both layers are down and the raw edges are lined up with the edge of the quilt. So I'm not going to start at the top of the binding. I'm going to bump down. I'm using my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'll be removing the pins as I go. I'm stitching through both layers of the binding and the quilt top. I'm approaching that corner. I'm approximately 1.5 inches from the edge of the quilt there, the corner. I'm going to pick up the binding, and I'm going to bring it all the way to the right and fashion that little mitered corner going from edge to edge, and then I'm going to bring that binding back on top of itself, so my raw edge once again is aligned with the top of the quilt, and you may have to lift up your presser foot a bit. So make sure your needle is in the sunk position, and then you can stitch within 1/4 inch of that edge. And then once I get within 1/4 inch of the edge, I will sink the needle, lift up that presser foot, and pivot my project so I'm once again going straight, and the raw edge of the binding is aligned with the right hand edge of my quilt. And then I can continue on. And I will repeat that process at each corner. When we go, in case you're curious, when we go to turn this binding over to the opposite side, I will have a nice, beautiful corner, and all my edges will be finished. So I'm going to continue all the way around the quilt until I get 2 inches from where I started, and then we'll meet up again and I'll show you how to join the binding. Okay, so I've made it a few inches from where I started, and I have the 2 ends of the binding. So you're going to need to open that up on each end and get your right sides facing. If you feel you can do it, go ahead and line this up crossing again so you can get that mitered corner. If you are not confident that you can get the mitered corner, go ahead and straight stitch it right across there. So remember, you're taking in to account your seam allowance. So you're just going to overlap that enough to get your seam allowance and have the room that you need to stitch across there. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the straight stitch because I too am new to quilting and have not yet mastered that mitered corner for this part of the project. So I have trimmed it up and I'm just going to align those two ends right sides facing, and this is the trickiest part of binding, and it's simply just a matter of getting the fabric lined up. And then when you open that back up, it should lay nice, and you can tuck those seams over and give it a little press if you need, and then go ahead and continue that stitching right across as I was before. Okay, so I have my binding attached. Now I want to turn my project over to the right side there, and I'm going to pull that binding forward so I can feel the edge there of the quilt, and I'm going to put a pin in that, and I want to show you what's going to happen at the corners. So if you just kind of reach up in there and gently poke out that corner, and there's like an under and an over. Get your under situated first, your under layer of binding, and then bring down your mitered corner and line that up nice. And this is a nice wide binding, which looks beautiful with this piece. So then get a pin inside of there, and you have a perfect mitered corner with this. And then you can continue down the long edge. You'll get to the next corner and you'll do the same thing. Okay, I've gone all the way around and I've pinned my binding in place. I'm absolutely thrilled with those corners. They came together so nice. Now the next step is for me to put this up on the machine and stitch right along that edge of the binding on the front of the quilt. When I get to the corners, I'll make sure those are still aligned nice. I'll sink that needle and pivot and continue around the edge. This is definitely a point where you could hand sew this binding on if you want. I would never have the patience for that, so I'm just going to sew as close as I can right to that finished edge of the binding and work my way all the way around the quilt. Now this is a perfect time to attach your label to your quilt. If you wanted to tuck it right under that binding, you could do that, or you could wait until it's finished and then attach it to the back. I made it all the way around the edge and I'm so thrilled with this project. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope that you found this to be useful and you are inspired to sew a quilt of your own. Wow, that was a lot of fun. I'm so thrilled with my quilt. It's just gorgeous. I love this fabric. I got this from Amy Butler. It is actually hand dyed and hand blocked in India, and it is perfect for this project. I will be keeping this quilt. I think it turned out beautifully. I love that I have finally learned how to quilt. Yes, I am still absolutely a beginner, but that joy for quilting has been sparked within me, and the sky is the limit now. I want to offer a heartfelt thanks to the experts in our friendship circle who showed up over the course of a year and shared their knowledge with those of us in the group who are new to quilting, myself included. And that's really the main reason why I wanted to make this video. We met once a month for a year, and we had one block a month for 9 months. And then we talked about piecing the quilt together. We talked about adding sashing, adding borders, actually quilting the project, and then adding the binding. So I've taken a year's worth of knowledge and compacted it into this one video for you. So if you enjoyed the video, kindly give it a thumbs up. If you would like to see more videos like this, please do subscribe to the channel. And then if you really enjoyed the project and are interested in learning more about quilting, hop on over to AndreaMarieChapman.com. I'll put the link down in the notes and join our friendship circle. Year 2 of the friendship circle begins in August of 2023, and it's just one meeting a month, and at the end of the year, I promise you will have a beautiful piece, and you will have learned a lot and made some new friends in the process. So there's absolutely no charge to join the friendship circle, but it certainly does add a lot of value to the members' lives who show up for our monthly meetings. So please don't be deceived by the price tag. So I will see you soon in another video. Until then, as always, please know the creative genius in me will be celebrating the creative genius in you. And I hope you all have a beautiful day. Thank you so much for quilting with me.